Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Welcome to Many Happy Returns, where we aim to make you a better investor. I'm Roman.
And I'm Michael.
4 months after Trump shocked markets with sweeping tariffs, the results are in. New trade deals tilted towards American interests, a resilient economy, and Wall Street's return to record highs.
Today we ask whether Trump has won the trade war, or if it's too soon to tell. And in today's dumb question of the week, are trade deals about more than tariffs? All right, let's get into it. So when Trump took office for his second term, the effective American tariff rate was around 2.5%. Since then, it's jumped to somewhere between 17 and 19%, depending on which estimate you believe. And it'll probably end up at around 20% on a trade-weighted average across the world, which is the highest in a century. Now, Roman, when he announced all these tariffs, people were saying, this is a bit of a bold move, markets panicked, and a lot of economists said this is going to be self-defeating. The world's not going to let him get away with this, but he seems to be getting away with it.
Yeah, I'd say that's a fair summary. I think so far there hasn't been much retaliation at all. A lot of people have simply caved in, a lot of countries have caved in, and the US has used its heft economically very effectively. So I think at the back of the minds of world leaders, it's all about how long have we got to put up with this? We've got about 3.5 years left of the Trump presidency. Will things be the same as this after the Trump presidency ends? So I think from their point of view, it's really a question of, can we suffer this short-term pain? And at the end of it, is it going to improve?
Was there no way they could have realistically stood up to Trump? Because if we look at it, he struck so-called framework agreements with around 8 countries or blocs. So obviously the UK, the EU, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, Pakistan, and the Philippines. And altogether, that accounts for around 40% of US trade flows. Now, the big one that's not in there is China. But would the only way for the world to have maybe stood up to Trump and the might of the US would be to have presented a more united front? And we didn't really see that. Everyone started doing their own deals independently with Trump.
Yeah, it's amazing that one country can unilaterally impose tariffs on the rest of the world, and yet no one in the rest of the world, well, very few countries, have actually stood up to it.
China's the only one, really. Maybe Canada as well has tried.
Yeah, that's right. And I think Canada was surprising because they are so dependent on the United States for exports. So that was very brave of them. The real shocker for me was the EU, because there they did have, in theory at least, the economic heft to stand up to Trump, because they're a huge economic bloc and very powerful. But it turned out that was a bit of a paper tiger. And when push came to shove, they collapsed. And that was due to internal bickering about what the consequences of standing up to Trump would be.
So shall we just remind everyone in very broad terms what the agreement is between the EU and the US? And it's clearly an asymmetric agreement. What's been agreed is that for most goods exported from the EU into the US, there'll be a 15% tariff. Whereas for US goods going into the EU, there'll basically be no tariff. And they've even dropped some tariffs that they did have on certain categories of good.
And just to compare that with what the EU actually wanted, it was symmetric zero tariffs, because they're big trade partners. If you look at US imports, the EU is the largest single bloc or country.
And I think a lot of people pointed to the fact that the EU's got a worse deal than the UK. And obviously that's been framed in the context of Brexit. Like, we've finally seen a Brexit benefit.
I think that's true. And I think that is one of the first real tangible benefits of Brexit. But on the other hand, if you look at what we had to do, we caved in very early when it came to charming Trump. Unfortunately, we had the royal family.
Yeah, I don't even know if we caved in. We ended up with a 10% tariff, which is the baseline, which is what countries like Australia have also got. And the unifying thing between the UK and Australia and the countries with this baseline tariff is that we run a trade deficit with the United States, at least in terms of goods.
Yeah, if you include services, I think it's roughly neck and neck. I don't think there's a big deficit at all.
But obviously the EU runs a huge surplus in goods with the US. It sells a lot of cars and pharmaceuticals and all sorts of other things into America. So I guess whether you think the EU's achieved a good outcome depends if you think they could have done better. Now, Trump's initial proposal was for a 30% tariff on EU imports. So they've ended up with half of that. And if you read the sort of behind the scenes accounts, it seems like for a long time it was looking like 21% would be the deal. So, 15% seems better than that. But a lot of people were surprised, I think, like you said, that the whole reason for the EU is that a continent has grouped together. So we've got the heft to get good trade terms. So has this undermined the reason for the EU, or one of the reasons?
I think that's important. That's one of the reasons. Another one is that internal trade is completely frictionless. So it's very cheap to move money, goods inside the EU. And a lot of the trade, if you look at any single country in the EU, you'll see that that's reflected in their data. Another reason, of course, is to stop us doing this once-in-a-generation bloodbath, which is when we try and kill each other for no particular reason. So, it succeeded on those terms. We haven't had a war in Europe for a long time, or at least not within the EU. But certainly in terms of the heft of the trade negotiations, yeah, that was a big failure.
And do you think it was all down to the fact that there was these internal divisions you mentioned? So I think it's pretty clear that Germany was desperate for a deal. Its economy is struggling and its car manufacturers cannot afford to lose the US market. Whereas maybe France had different priorities, or at least when the deal was announced, they spoke up pretty strongly about how they didn't necessarily support it.
I think that's part of it. And defense is also another big consideration, because remember that the US has certainly made noises about not being so supportive of European defense and expecting Europe to spend more to do that, to defend themselves. A lot of the military equipment which the EU already has is US stuff. And if you want that to continue working and you want the ammunition for that hardware, well, you better hope that the US is going to carry on providing it.
Yeah, I think the Trump administration genuinely scared the EU, especially with what's going on in Ukraine, that Brussels didn't want to risk a complete withdrawal of the US from Europe. And usually in trade negotiations, the US has not sort of put defense on the table as a quid pro quo, but it kind of did this time, at least implicitly. I think the other point in terms of the dependence of the EU on the US is around technology. We are dependent on US big tech firms. We keep talking about taxing them and regulating them, which I'm not saying is the wrong thing to do, but it's not so dissimilar to the military question where, imagine if Apple and Google pulled out of Europe. We'd be pretty stuffed.
And there is no alternative at the moment. So, for example, if you want something like Office software or a cloud solution, would you turn to China? Would you be happy with your client's data being stored in the People's Republic? And I think a lot of people would say no. They still trust the US more than they trust China. It's still seen as an ally. But I think that's why Trump is playing a very dangerous game here. If he puts himself on a par with China in terms of trust, then suddenly that logic goes away. And then China really could compete for things like tech as well as stuff.
A lot of the polling shows that, unsurprisingly, trust in the US from the rest of the world, including Europe, has fallen, and also the perception of them as a reliable ally, whereas that has slightly reversed with China, just by virtue of the fact they're not being as overtly aggressive to us, I guess, as the US is. But it should be noted that the EU is now in dispute with China because as the Chinese have been able to sell less to America because of these tariffs, the goods have got to go somewhere and they've headed in our direction.
Yeah, I noticed that.
So maybe the sort of 4D chess Trump is playing is going to make the EU and China less friendly. Roman, who knows how these things shake out?
Now, as an old bloke, it's often the case that I have to have these big mental jumps when I notice data that's really changed. It happens with FX rates. It happens with the age of teachers.
Why are policemen getting younger every year? I've noticed that now.
But that also applies to GDP figures. And it's astonishing, if you look at pre-global financial crisis versus now, how much things have changed.
I actually pulled the numbers out for this podcast because I had the mental model too, I think like you did, that the US and the EU are roughly the same size as economies. That is not true. If we go back to 2008, the EU's economy was actually around 10% bigger than that of the US. But if we look at what's happened since the financial crisis, the rates of growth have just diverged completely. So EU GDP has increased just 13.5%. It's gone from around $16 trillion to around $18.5 trillion. whereas US GDP has grown by almost 90%. It's gone from $14.7 trillion to more than $27 trillion today. So while we said that the economies of the two were roughly the same size in 2008, even the EU was a little bit bigger, today the EU's economy is just 2/3 the size of the US. And to be clear, Britain's excluded from all of this, so it's not a Brexit effect.
It is shocking. And you've got an economy which has doubled in size over that period versus something which has just grown a little bit, just grown by average standards in developed markets.
I think this is the big reason why the US is able to push around the EU, is that Europe is a fading power economically and militarily, and the US is not. It's still a vital economy.
And we did a whole episode about the Draghi report, which talked about all the failings in Europe, but also how to address them, which it has to be said the EU has largely ignored at its own peril and also at its own cost.
Yeah, I think it's the problems we all sort of instinctively know that exist within Europe, where it's kind of overly bureaucratic because it operates by consensus largely. Brussels doesn't have much in the way of tax raising powers, so it leans into what it can do, which is regulations. And something you said earlier, which is the EU has a frictionless internal market. Like the Draghi report seems to make clear that that isn't the case. Yeah, there's no tariffs, but there are a lot of these non-tariff barriers which impact trade, and that does have a cost. Whereas the US pretty much does have frictionless internal trade. I remember that Jean-Claude Juncker, who is head of the European Commission, he once said that we all know what to do, but we don't know how to get re-elected once we've done it.
But we see this repeatedly. You have these centrifugal forces which tend to make the EU fly apart and fragment. Not in terms of the actual union itself, at least not yet.
One of us has left.
Yeah. But particularly I was thinking about things like immigration and the friction that that's caused between EU members. So whenever you apply pressure to the system, it certainly looks very fragile in the Eurozone. And the direction of travel politically certainly seems to be towards fragmentation and nationalism. So coming back to this point about the amount of years that Trump's got left in office, presumably people are thinking, well, I'll just agree to buy some stuff, gas, whatever, from the United States, military goods, and then at the end of the period, we'll just not quite achieve what we said we would, and somebody else is going to be in power anyway.
That's the playbook China used in Trump's first term, right? They made this pledge to up the amount of US goods they bought by a huge amount, and they never really delivered it. Ultimately, it came down to the Biden administration to enforce the agreement, but they never really did up their purchases of US goods that much. Maybe we'll see similar this time. So as part of the understanding between the EU and the US, Brussels has made, I'd say like symbolic pledges to buy $750 billion worth of US energy, I'm guessing natural gas, and invest over $600 billion into America. But this isn't money that would be centrally spent. Like the EU doesn't have a budget for that. It's going to have to encourage private companies. And I suspect has just sort of aggregated up numbers that it thinks will happen in the coming years. Trump's deal with Japan does similar. And there's no enforcement mechanism for this. So if everything goes off the rails, maybe it'll be because the numbers don't add up.
Yeah, it does feel as if they just walk away with flimsy sheets of paper with promises written on, whereas trade agreements take years when you really hammer out the details and the exceptions. So I just think a lot of this is just so that Trump can declare a victory, so it looks good to his people at home, which is, after all he cares about.
But still, walking away with asymmetric tariffs with the EU is a big deal. Europe has not agreed to that kind of thing before.
Yeah, that was a shock. But let's just see how that actually pans out. Not just in the Trump term, but beyond it. I suspect a lot of that is not going to stick. Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Trading 212 Stocks and Shares ISA is the cheapest way to invest, with zero commission and the lowest FX fees I could find on the market. Looking to keep things simple, you can easily automate your investing with pies that allow you to rebalance your portfolio at the click of a button. Customers with Invest accounts can also benefit from the Trading 212 card, which has no FX fees, true interbank rates, and offers 1.5% cash back on all transactions up to £15 per month. Many Happy Returns listeners can claim free fractional shares worth up to £100. Just create and verify a Trading 212 Invest or Stocks ISA account, make a minimum deposit of £1 and use the promo code RAMIN, RAMIN, within 10 days of signing up, or use the link in the show notes. When investing, your capital is at risk and you may get back less than invested. Past performance doesn't guarantee future results. Pies and Autoinvest is an execution-only service, not investment advice or portfolio management. Automatic investing refers to executing scheduled deposits. You are responsible for all investment and rebalancing decisions. Free shares can be fractional. 212 cards are issued by Paynetics, which provide all payment services. Trading 212 provides customer support and user interface. Terms and fees apply.
Okay, so we've said that the Trump administration has managed to put in place tariffs that are sort of 15 to 20% for the most part. But who's actually paying these tariffs?
So let's imagine that we're a company exporting to the US. Is it us that actually pays the tariff? No, it's the company we sell the stuff to. And it's a tax. It's an internal tax in the US. So the importing company pays that tax to the US Treasury. So that's the physical, actual mechanism. However, there's lots of slippery logic around who actually pays it in reality.
Yeah, if you think about it, there's a few people who could pay the tariffs ultimately. It could be the foreign manufacturer who's making the goods. They could absorb the costs with lower margins. It could be the US importer who could take it out of their margins. Or, and what most economists think is most likely, is that the cost ultimately gets passed on to consumers in America. Now, just as an aside, there are other things that happen in the background. Like if there's a very high tariff on one country but not on another, then you'll get a kind of realignment of trade where the market shifts where things are being imported from. But let's put that to one side for the moment. Goldman Sachs this week actually published an analysis of who is really paying these tariffs, at least so far.
It's great to have interns, isn't it? These people actually do the work. So fortunately, we can make use of that army of serfs at Goldman. And we can see that foreign exporters absorbed about 14% of the US tariffs, which is surprisingly large. So here, for example, it would be a company that was exporting to the US, and in order to make their exports more attractive, they took a hit and lowered their prices. But the entity which ate most of the impact was US companies. So these are the importing companies taking a hit on their margins. They absorbed 64%. And so far, at least, US consumers have only had to absorb 22%. Now, the reason why I think these figures will change quite rapidly is that if we look at the behavior of companies, they imported a lot of inventory before the tariffs kicked in, so that'll be a temporary effect as they've worked through that inventory. So far, at least, US companies have absorbed a lot of the increased prices, but they can only do that for so long. And I think at a certain point, they're going to start passing it on to US consumers. Maybe they'll do it gradually so that it doesn't appear in the numbers.
Yeah, I think that's right. And certainly that's what Goldman suggests too. And I think up to now, and these figures only go up to June, by the way, US companies have been thinking, well, we don't quite know where tariffs are going to land, right? It's been such a flip-flop back and forth that let's not hike our prices massively for consumers and risk losing market share when it might only last a month or two. We'll just eat it for now. But now we know pretty much where tariffs are going to land. The time has come to rethink pricing, maybe. Now, Goldman estimate where it's going to end up later in the year. So as you said, until now, it appears that American consumers have faced 22% of the cost of tariffs, whereas Goldman expects that to end up at 67%. So basically, shoppers in America are going to be paying 2/3 of the cost of these tariffs. And like you say, American businesses are not going to put up with their margins being compressed for long. That's 64% of the cost you said they've been facing. It'll probably drop to more like 10%, according to Goldman. But foreign exporters are expected to bear a higher share than now. Up to now, it's been 14% of the cost of tariffs. Goldman thinks it'll rise to 25%.
Now, there is something subtle here, which I thought was very interesting, which is that there are several Italian trade associations which are asking for compensation from the EU to make up for those losses. Now, that's not going to show up in the data necessarily, but that is an example of these tariffs affecting countries outside the US.
Yeah, if you believe Goldman, in terms of the effect on business, we're looking at 25% being borne by the foreign companies and only 10% being borne by the US companies. The big impact, though, will be on consumers, and they will feel it in the US in terms of inflation, if Goldman is right. Up to now, inflation has been pretty contained, maybe surprisingly so. But if companies do start passing on these higher costs, the forecast is that core PCE inflation, which is what the Fed really looks at, will rise to around 3.2% by the end of the year. And Goldman says that's based on an underlying inflation forecast of 2.4%. So basically, if we didn't have tariffs, you're looking at 2.4%, but now that we do, more like 3.2%.
So if you think about monetary policy in the US, higher inflation obviously shifts towards higher rates, and that's clearly not what Trump wants. At the same time, we've got weakening jobs data in the US, we think, and that pushes in the opposite direction. So this is not going to make for a happy President Trump. So either they have to shut down all of the statistical agencies, or this is going to start showing up in the data.
Or Goldman's forecast is wrong, and companies keep eating the cost.
It's certainly possible, because another threat for one of the US companies, which is going to start passing on the costs, is that they get singled out by the president. And he says, this company is responsible for increasing costs for US citizens. And as a result of that, there could be a huge backlash for that company. So that's why I think they're probably going to do it very gradually.
Yeah. There's also a danger here that this kind of price rising mechanic can be self-reinforcing. Now, the route we usually talk about is the fact that if inflation goes up, even if it's a one-time bump, people adjust their expectations, want higher wages, which leads to a wage price spiral. But there is another route. I've seen anecdotes and even sort of anonymized surveys with CEOs of US businesses who say that once tariff costs start getting passed on to American consumers, even if my company is not directly affected by tariffs, I can sneak in price rises at the same time, and people will blame the tariffs.
In fact, Jerome Powell has often referred to an example of this, where he says that during the previous set of tariffs, washing machines were tariffed, but dryers weren't. But dryer prices increased, even though they weren't affected. So that's a little bit naughty of the companies.
It's good laundering.
Tariff laundering. I love that.
So I think we've answered the question of who pays the tariffs. And the answer is, it's complicated. But who receives the tariffs? This is a lot of money now, isn't it?
Well, as we said, it's the US Treasury, and this is going to form an increasingly large part of the US income for the federal government. Not a huge part, it has to be said. So last year it made up just under 2% of federal revenue. Now it's going to double to just under 4%.
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly where it will land this year because the tariff policy is still in flux. In 2024, like you say, around 1.6% of federal revenues, which was $77 billion, came from tariffs. It's going to be a lot higher this year, but probably less than 5% still.
You have to remember how big federal revenue is in the United States. We're talking about $5 trillion. So even though these numbers sound absolutely huge, in terms of the total government revenue, they aren't that large or significant. And there's no way you could make up US tax revenue via tariffs. However, it's been very expensive and disruptive to actually introduce these tariffs for all these importing companies. So for a government in future to reverse them and to switch off that source of revenue is going to be that much more difficult.
Yeah, and also if tariffs do end up being around 5% of the federal budget, that's still a significant amount, right? It's not easy for a government to reverse it and give up several percentage points of revenue, especially when they're running big fiscal deficits.
I think that's right. And that's one reason why when the next government comes into power, whoever it is, it's going to be difficult to roll this stuff back.
I think they won't roll it back for free. Like if the EU comes and says, okay, Trump's gone, let's be sensible here. How about we go for zero tariffs? I think the US would be more like, well, what are you going to give me then? They're not a charity.
That's right. So I think in those terms, it has been a victory for Trump, particularly with the EU.
I think it's a real open question of whether the world can return to this idea that trade is not zero sum and that low tariffs kind of benefit everyone and make us all richer in the long term, mostly due to the fact that countries can focus on their specializations. But at the moment, we've really gone in the opposite direction. Mercantilism is back.
Well, however the world sees it, Trump definitely sees it as zero sum. And there have been impacts on US exports already. Now, overall, US exports haven't fallen year on year, at least using data to June 2025. But if you break it down by sector, it is quite shocking. All of the exports which are to China have been hugely negatively impacted. A lot of that is agricultural exports. So soybean exports to China, they were worth $9 billion in June 2025. Now that's down about 17% from the previous year. And that's the pattern that we saw previously in the previous trade war. Soybean exports fell by 77%, corn by 88%, wheat by 61%. So China has lots of people who are hungry, and a lot of the food used to come from the US. So that's one place where it's going to hurt US agriculture.
I saw that America's trade deficit with China has fallen to its smallest in more than 21 years, which isn't surprising to me. Like, the tariffs got up to more than 100% at one point, which is more or less an embargo on trade between the two countries. So far fewer Chinese products were ending up in the US. If you look at the overall US trade deficit, which I think is one of the key metrics the Trump administration looks at, that is really volatile at the moment. Because like you said, we've got front running and stockpiling. Goods are just being moved around the world when there's like a pause in tariffs, and no one can quite work out what's going on yet. If we zoom out a little bit though, and go back to the start of the 1990s, the US didn't have a trade deficit. Its trade was balanced with the rest of the world, and it's just grown and grown since then. It remains to be seen whether tariffs are the means to close that gap. A lot of economists would say it's not really possible to close the gap because Americans want to consume more than they produce.
I also think you have to look at the longer term shifts that are going to result from this. There is clear substitution for US exports. We saw it in agricultural products, where Brazil picked up the slack for soybeans. That happened in the last trade war. And even in tech, I think some countries and some companies are creating parallel supply chains for tech from those two different blocks, the US bloc and the Chinese bloc. And when we think about US exporters, remember that this is going to increase their costs. If they're having to import things, even if it's domestically produced now, it'll probably cost more for a steel, for example. So this is making them less competitive.
Yeah, I think the impact on US businesses is really hard to untangle. And there are a lot of routes where you could see them definitely becoming less competitive. Yes, those intermediate goods are going to cost more to import. But also, if these tariffs that the Trump administration has put in reduce competition for US companies because, fewer foreign goods can come in, they're more costly, everything else being equal, you'd think that, can make US companies a bit lazy, a bit complacent, and therefore less likely to be successful in international markets selling their goods because they're just not going to be as good. This is a long-term effect, but this is one of the reasons why economists generally think that free trade is good for competitiveness. But if we think about the Trump administration, which clearly has a populist agenda and has its own theory about how economics and trade works, I think we'd say broadly it's got what it wants so far. It's managed to put in place large parts of its tariff policy without a tit-for-tat trade war. The stock market is doing okay, the economy is doing well, inflation hasn't gone massively higher yet. It's raising revenue for the federal government. Basically, we're now in a situation where, okay, they've done what they said they were going to do. Let's see if it works. Let's see if their theory's right. So what could still go wrong for Trump's trade plan?
I think the first point I'd make is that we are starting to see the numbers looking a little bit weaker in terms of jobs, quite a lot weaker if you consider the recent revisions. That, of course, led to firing of the head of the Bureau of Labour Statistics. Then we'll probably start to see it show up in the inflation data, and then finally in growth numbers in the US. Now, there are only so many people you can fire to pretend that it's not a problem, but it will be a problem.
Does that depend on how bad the numbers get? Like if inflation goes back to 3%, that's not the end of the world.
No, I agree. But if unemployment goes up, that is a problem, because that's real human suffering. I think there is a little bit of leeway here because the US is a very wealthy country. The average American can pay more for their groceries and for their imports and their high-end goods, which they've imported from Europe. if they paid 15% more for a Mercedes, well, for someone who can afford a Mercedes in the first place, that's not going to hugely affect their consumption. But when it's your average Joe in the street, which is losing their job because of the tariffs, suddenly that's much more difficult to weather politically, particularly given Trump's base.
I think it might be really hard for everyone to untangle the impact of tariffs on the US economy from everything else that the Trump administration is changing. Like, they've passed a pretty dramatic change to the tax code. They're doing huge things around immigration and also around science funding and federal subsidy plans generally on things like EVs. It's going to be a little bit like Brexit in a way, where we can't quite work out what's due to Brexit and what's just due to everything else going on in the UK.
But what will be clear is that it's this administration's policies which are having those negative impacts. So I think that'll be difficult to explain away or point the finger of blame to someone like the Fed.
That's if those negative impacts do show up, right? I think we should say someone's not tried this policy in a long time, like maybe 100 years. The economy's a lot different than it was 100 years ago. Like, maybe Trump's theory of economics, incoherent as it is, will work out for America. Or maybe the effects will be pushed beyond the end of his term.
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility. Another thing we should consider is whether these tariffs will be considered legal. Will the American courts push back on it and reverse some of the tariffs?
Certainly the justification that Trump's used, which is around the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, is novel and untested in court. Typically, that act has been used infrequently and just for sanctioning America's enemies and freezing their assets, things like that, not for implementing global tariffs. But it would be a brave court to completely overrule what seems to be a signature victory in some sense for Trump. Like, he's kind of getting what he wants. And the court would probably be painted badly by the administration if they scrapped it all.
Yeah, it looks like you're hurting American interests. Look at our revenue from tariffs, and you're effectively cutting federal revenue. And this pays for your jobs.
I know there's a case working its way through the appeals court. It's going to end up at the Supreme Court if they rule against the administration.
And remember, there are several Trump appointees in that Supreme Court, so they will be more likely, I think, to support his policies.
Yeah, and also just the trend over the last 100 years has been to give more and more powers to the executive in America at the expense of Congress. Because remember, constitutionally, budgetary powers and trade powers sit with Congress. But they've delegated them to some extent to the administration.
Or the bond market.
Yeah. If we're thinking about other things that could cause Trump's trade plan to go wrong, I wouldn't rule out Trump himself. He's pretty volatile and changes his mind a lot. What if one morning he wakes up and says, you know what, I'm still angry at the EU. I'm scrapping that deal. Let's go for a trade war. You know, you can't rule that out.
Yeah, if he feels the attention starting to wane, this is exactly what he does, because he becomes the centre of attention for global media. And he has been unbelievably successful at grasping the narrative. It's so unusual to look at the BBC website, for example, now, or the FT, without seeing some Trump headline.
Yeah, he kind of sets the weather for the world, doesn't he? And I don't think you can put too much trust in an agreement you make with Trump. If you look through his history, there'll be many contractors that say that. But also, remember in his first term, he did a trade deal with Canada and Mexico, which he's now gone back on. So I think these deals only last as long as Trump sees that he can't get a better deal.
And I think there are some things which you can't measure economically. You can't look at a trade number and measure America's soft power. A lot of people felt warm and fuzzy about the US. And that was true all over the world, largely because of US movies, I think. That is their primary export of American values, I'd say.
Yeah, the administration seemed determined to weaken America's soft power, both by defunding international aid agencies and things like that, and pulling back from international cooperation. But also, as you say, just changing the vibes about America. To go back to the question right at the start, has Trump won the trade war? There was a quote in the New York Times I read, which I think summed it up, which said, "The president's plan for global trade now looks like a political victory. Whether it will be an economic success remains much more debatable."
Now, we haven't mentioned the effect of tariffs on investors, but that's the kind of thing that we cover in our weekly market roundup. We look at the most important news stories for investors and make sure that you keep up to date with it. It's really easy to sign up. Just go to our website, pensioncraft.com/newsletter.
Okay, today's dumb question of the week. Are trade deals about more than tariffs? Now, if you've been following the announcements in recent months from the Trump administration, you'll have seen a lot of talk about how we're signing a trade deal with this country, a trade deal with this country. But as far as I'm concerned, Roman, no trade deals have been signed. At best, they're statements of intent or memorandums of understanding, that kind of thing. They might have agreed a tariff rate, but there's a lot more to talk about before you ink a trade deal.
Yeah, this is an unbelievably detailed process because if you think about billions in trade between two countries, just imagine the number of moving parts, the number of companies involved, the number of technical specifications of the kind of things which can be and can't be imported. And now we have to think about the costs of those imports.
So as I understand it, there's always one strand of the negotiations, which is around trade facilitation, if you like. How does customs work? How does the logistics work? What are the rules around documentation for goods and trusted trader programs and these kind of de minimis thresholds where we don't even need to pay tariffs if it's below a certain level? These costs implicitly can often be equivalent to a small tariff of 2 or 3%.
Or if you have to ensure that your product meets those standards, that can delay launch of the product. Now, that's pretty difficult to quantify.
Standards is a big one. If you look at the trade deals the EU strikes, some of the biggest sections in them are around harmonising standards and transparency and often mutual recognition, where if one country says this product meets the standards and is safe for sale, then it can be sold across all the countries. These deals that the US is doing don't really get into that kind of detail.
Plus, if a country is trying to circumvent these tariffs by shipping via a third country, you also have to have rules of origin tests.
Yeah, that's kind of saying how British does it have to be to count as a British good? And you have a threshold saying, 60% of the value add has to have been done in the country, or whatever it might be.
Now, the focus of the Trump tariff regime has been very much on goods rather than services. But services are a super important export from the US, certainly if you consider them. And trade is much more balanced if you consider services as well as goods. But in the case of services, it's much more a binary decision. Are you allowed to export this service to this country? Rather than how much do you charge based on the amount of those exports?
Yeah, you can't really easily tariff services because they don't go through customs. The way a good's tariffed is customs will take that good until you pay them the money. Whereas if it's going down a fiber optic cable, how can you tariff it so easily? Like if someone said there's tariffs on British service exports into Europe, how are they going to make sure PensionCraft pays its tariffs? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so even though digital services do leave a log, it would be so difficult trying to charge for individual AI queries or amount of data stored.
And I think also why we're seeing so much talk about digital service taxes. We'll just tax the big tech giants and we'll get to roughly the same place as a services tariff. And I think that is one of the wins the EU had actually in the trade agreement with the US, is that they retained fiscal autonomy. They didn't agree to scrap all their digital service taxes or the ability to regulate US big tech, which is something the Trump administration was pushing for.
But that is something you can measure. You can look at the amount of revenue generated in a given country by their digital services imports. So as you say, you're not physically importing stuff via a port, which you can actually log, but you can look at that revenue generation if you trust the company's accounts.
That's the thing. There are a lot of wheezes, aren't there? Especially around transfer pricing and intellectual property, where you can hold the patents in one low tax jurisdiction and do some games. And actually, intellectual property is another key thing in trade agreements, like recognizing each other's laws around copyright and patents.
And that's one thing which justifiably, I think, the US has complained about when it comes to China. They haven't enforced foreign countries' IP.
In fact, they've gone further than that and forced foreign companies to license or transfer IP to Chinese companies so that they can learn from it and make their own products.
Another important category is government procurement, because the government, of course, spends a lot of money. And the question is whether foreign firms can bid on government contracts and whether that's going to directly disadvantage companies in the country. Then we've got to consider things like competition rules, state-owned enterprises, and whether you have some kind of level playing field commitments.
Subsidies is the big one. Countries are always tempted to artificially boost their domestic producers to give them a leg up in terms of international trade. And a big part of trade deals is monitoring that and saying what is and isn't allowed from partnership between the state and the private sector.
And it might also be funding. If you provide cheap funding, that might be trade funding, it might be funding for the company itself, which is doing the exports. But if you borrow at government rate, well, that's going to be very competitive because a company doesn't have to pay the corporate bond spread. Then there are things like whether a country upholds labour rights. Were these goods created via what's essentially almost slave labour? And then you have to police the actual agreement itself. What happens if the country does breach some of the agreements? What can you do? What's the restitution?
And that's a really thorny question because national courts can't be trusted to rule on international disputes. So who's going to rule? There's usually some sort of arbitration mechanism.
And one big casualty of this trade war has been the World Trade Organization, which used to have some heft, but now has almost none. I'd say that it's pretty much a non-existent entity now.
Yeah, we're operating on a system of handshake deals.
And ex posts.
But whatever's agreed in terms of trade is hugely influential for economies around the world. If you're a business thinking about where am I going to build my factory, you need to think about these trade deals and be able to rely on them because ultimately you're trying to pick a location which allows you to serve multiple markets simultaneously.
I think a lot of people who run companies really can absorb a lot of change, but the rate of change that we see right now is just not absorbable, and the uncertainty it's created has made business very difficult. If you want to plan where you're going to build your factories, where you're going to get your revenue from, the product lines you're creating, that's so difficult now that things are in flux. So what companies are really craving is certainty. So they're probably thinking, fine, get the tariffs done, just keep it steady for a while so that I can run my business.
Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Keep sending us your questions, no matter how dumb, at mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out pensioncraft.com for all the information about our membership, courses, and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Romin Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.